to the AD&A Presents. Josh Miller is a tech entrepreneur who stumbled into human rights. He co-founded 3Play Media in 2007 with a straightforward idea that more people should be able to access video content. And what started at MIT as a captioning and transcription service grew into the largest media accessibility company in North America. It's now serving over 10,000 customers across education, entertainment, and enterprise. In 2022, 3Play acquired Caption Max, which brought audio description directly into their work, and that signaled accessibility and storytelling belong in the same conversation. Josh also sits on the CTA Content and Entertainment Council, which means he's regularly in rooms where technology, media, and accessibility policy get shaped and braided together. His background is in telecom and media consulting, so when he talks about why accessibility decisions get made the way they do, he's drawing on some real experience with how money, infrastructure, and intention interact, and maybe sometimes don't. So I think about how he's come out of telecom and media consulting, not disability advocacy, that maybe something shifted and maybe someone showed him something. So maybe we'll get into that. Thanks so much for joining us, Josh.
Thanks, Roy. Appreciate it. And that was a beautiful articulation of how we got here.
How to distill 17 years.
Oh man. I have to kind of like wake myself up and realize it's been that long sometimes. It's been a ride and like in good ways, bad, challenging ways. I don't want to use the word bad, but challenging ways. And I think the challenges make for both opportunities and learning experiences. So we definitely take the approach of always be learning.
Let's take that always be learning back to the beginning. Something must have shifted, or maybe somebody showed you something that made accessibility feel more like this, let's call it a market opportunity. Was there a moment?
Yeah, absolutely. So it started with, there were four of us who started the company together at MIT. We were at MIT Sloan, the business school there. One of our co-founders who had a relationship with some of the folks at MIT OpenCourseWare. And that was the first group really putting lectures up online for free. And these were MIT lectures, not exactly the easiest content in the world, but really amazing content. And they were told by their funding organizations, one of the foundations that were giving them money, that they needed to make the content accessible for the checks to keep coming. So it was pretty straightforward that this was driven by need. At the time, this is 2007, so there were no regulations for web content. YouTube was still very new. I don't think Lazy Sunday had come out quite yet from SNL, which like really blew up YouTube. It was early days of this digital content craze. And so they started going out to the traditional players to see what it would cost to get their captioning done. And so when I say traditional players, I mean, these are the companies that were working with major media companies who had big budgets to get captioning done. So when they got their quotes, it was going to be half their annual budget. It was completely untenable. We were having these conversations and one thing led to another, started working with a professor in the spoken language lab at MIT and kind of hoped, oh, we can use speech recognition and like this will be so much easier. And the answer was not even close. No way. But it was enough to say, we're at MIT, like we're surrounded by fascinating technology. We're talking about how to build businesses. And it was clear that this was an emerging need for digital content. And obviously, people were really excited about web videos. Other schools were starting to put videos online. This was going to be a real need. This was going to be a real issue that students, are you kidding? Students can't access the content? That seems ridiculous. And the methods to create captions at the time just seemed a little old-fashioned. And they weren't bad, but they weren't technology driven. So we saw this as an opportunity to use technology, recognizing that humans were still required to do this well, and I would argue still are, that we could basically design a new process using technology, building technology to really think about this differently. And so we often use the phrase quality at scale, and that's what we set out to do.
It's funny that conversation about quality and quantity can sometimes be a zero-sum game, that those two things sometimes fight against each other. And you use the word untenable to begin with the problem that you were facing at MIT Sloan, and to use the tech process to get to that quality at scale. I can only imagine there might be some parallels with the Caption Max acquisition, that That's bringing, you already were doing audio description, but the Caption Max brought something else. Maybe it was the way it was structured. Maybe it was the people that were there. When you think about the people that do that work,
Part of why we got really excited about Caption Max and National Captioning Canada, who also came on board around the same time, was more capabilities in these kind of, I would argue, higher end services. So we were doing audio description, as you mentioned, with humans doing the script writing, but we use synthetic voice. And we can talk all about that and the pros and cons of that. And a lot of that was because the main focus of the content we were working with was in the education space and in the corporate space, where that kind of emotional, more dramatic production is not required. It's about information conveyance. So it's about how do we actually make sure we can do this in a way that the consumer can actually consume the content appropriately. And so it made a lot of sense, because, especially with the budget constraints and so on. So we viewed the acquisition as an opportunity to get deeper into the media market and to bring on this skill set that we didn't have, because we did get asked for higher end audio description, higher end captions that had little things that around style guides around where do you break the caption line and italicizing a certain way. And we could do some of it, but we knew that we could do it, there were ways to do it better if we had the right expertise and things like that. So we saw a few different opportunities with that acquisition. And then from there, we were really focused on integrating it all in. And so I would say that it is all 3Play Media at this point, and they're just different service levels and different service options depending on the customer and the project requirements. We can go into a lot of detail there, but that's really the way we think about it now.
that framing of information versus emotional, that educational client, the corporate client, the lower budget clients, the what normally would be untenable for accessibility clients, and then the emotional, the storytelling, also the, let's call it higher tier in this context. That's a real clear distinction. And I think as our audience is educated about that, that starts to make sense. It starts to separate that all or nothing thinking of we're just leveling everything and making it horrible versus there's some nuance here.
Totally. Absolutely. This is not a one size fits all game. Not at all. I mean, not all content is equal. If you have a piece of content that gets 1 million views versus another piece of content that gets 3 views, but those 3 views are from people who are deaf or blind, right? Like completely different situation. The 3 views happen to be students who are studying for a final. That's critical content. How you define it matters. And the requirements are different for every piece of content, right? Like the Super Bowl is different from a local newscast. It just is. And it'd be silly to treat them the same way.
When you think about the decisions that are being made by your customers, they make the final call in a lot of ways. And I'm curious, has there ever been a client that maybe you lost or a conversation didn't go the way that you wanted because doing the right thing wasn't necessarily the cheapest thing?
Quick answer is yes. I think one of the biggest challenges that anyone especially in the accessibility world faces is that quite often the people buying the offering, buying the service, the product, whatever it may be, is not the person experiencing it. You look at a piece of software, like if I want to go buy a CRM tool, there's a good chance it's because I'm the head of sales and I'm going to be deep in it, and my whole team is going to be deep in it. And so anything that works well or doesn't work well, we are feeling that pain or feeling that joy. It is completely different in accessibility because the people buying it and making these key decisions are doing it on behalf of the audience, who they do not even talk to. Hopefully they do some kind of focus group work or get feedback, but the reality is they're making decisions that they think are right. So we see it vary tremendously from one organization to another. And a lot of times it does come down to philosophically, how does that organization operate? How do they view accessibility? And there are some certainly in the corporate space, even in the education, actually, I would say across the board, anyone producing video, you see different philosophies for how important accessibility is and therefore what their approach is.
When you think about watching something with audio description along with someone who uses it, what did that change for you?
A lot. Certainly, because I think it starts with what's their context in the first place. How do they even get to the content? What are they used to? And what do they appreciate? I think there are a lot of reasons why one approach is great in certain contexts and actually suboptimal in others. And it goes back to what we were talking about a second ago, which is like synthetic voice audio description for a public service announcement or a tutorial video might be fine. But if you're watching episode 3 of The Pit, you might want to think about that differently. And you should, right? Every piece of content has certain objectives, right? I'll say. And it could be to entertain, it could be to inform, could be to waste time, who knows. With that, the publisher has a certain set of requirements and a certain set of constraints. The constraints could be budget, it could be time, it could be quality. And I would put, quality can branch over to the requirement side too. And all of those things have to be taken into account. And so, to your question about really getting feedback from users, really understanding how they experience all of those contexts, but not just with video, really matters. So, how are they consuming text messages? How are they consuming the web? It kind of starts to give you a sense for what they feel comfortable with and what they don't.
I can't help but think the focus on context can help also inform the philosophy of how you can share that philosophy and educate your clients or your customers.
100%. And we get into those conversations all the time. And a lot of it does stem, certainly when in the audio description world, I think where it really comes out right now, because people are wrestling with this idea of what voice is right. A lot of it does come down to educating what's appropriate and what are we seeing from others and how they think about it. And we want to share that. We want to help them make that decision. With captioning, we run into it too, where people have certain style guides, and we'll actually push back sometimes and say, like, why is this in your style guide? This isn't actually as readable as you think. It might be pretty in concept, but it's not readable. And readable is what matters.
And I see how that can translate to other aspects of accessibility.
Totally.
When you think about the people who care most about audio description craft, those people might not be the ones deciding the budget. When you think about that gap, what does that look like from where you sit?
It looks like a challenge, I would argue, is one part. But I think a lot of it does get into, why is the budget what it is? And then what do they think they're sacrificing and what are they actually willing to sacrifice? And those might be two different things and they don't realize it. Understanding those constraints, I think, is really, really important. They might want the best possible audio description, but have a constraint that it has to get done in 3 days. So then the question is, what's realistic? And I think a lot of it is really walking them through the process and helping them get to a decision based on those constraints and understand the consequences too, right? They have to understand the consequences of those decisions and what they get or don't get with that. I think the other part then is, can you test the market a little bit before you make a final decision, right? So start with a couple episodes or a couple pieces of content, see what the response is, then you can make a real decision for the long term. We see that right now happening in the dubbing space, where people are more willing to test and get feedback than I think we see in the accessibility space, which is interesting. And I think maybe because the accessibility space is a little more mature, there is a little bit more of a drive to kind of make the decision and go.
When I was thinking about one of our first interactions, it was in a group meeting, and you set me up for this great question. And the thing that came out, the difference between you have to and you get to, that framing of obligation or requirement, you use the term constraints in that context, versus get to, the opportunity of accessibility, the wins that a company can get. Could you expand a little bit on that? Because in that meeting, we didn't have enough time.
No, for sure. I mean, and I think, you're very much an expert in this space and have seen a lot. So I took the opportunity to ask you this idea of, we run into a number of organizations that say they don't really need to do audio description, so they're going to avoid spending the money on it. Whereas captions have become a lot more of a table stake where people expect there to be captions. And so, how do we collectively help educate people that this is a good idea and better for their audience and a business opportunity, even when it looks like it's really expensive and maybe not necessary from the letter of the law? So that's kind of the foundation for it, I guess, if you will. And I think it's hard. It's hard to get people to really realize that this is a great thing to do and the right thing to do and a positive ROI filled thing to do. And so that was kind of where I was going. And I agree with you. This is something that you get to do. And again, there are going to be constraints and there are going to be requirements, but people can make that work. And I think that's the part that we have to get people to explore it. I'd throw back. I thought your articulation of this idea of you get to do it was really good. And I think it's worth, maybe if you don't mind, even restating it, because I think it's great for people to hear.
And this has worked effectively in a lot of different rooms. That sense of obligation that you have to do it. This is this legal requirement that has to happen, or you're going to get, and then name whatever punishment, the stick instead of the carrot. That becomes this pressure, and I can feel the stakes getting higher when I'm having the conversation with someone. It's, I don't want to do the wrong move. And so there's this stasis, this literally petrified, like wood, like I'm frozen and I don't know what to do. And if I step the wrong way, I'm going to get screwed. And that creates a different experience than when it's reframed as, here's this opportunity. Like, as you said, the return on investment. Here's the benefits. Look at this market share that you've been overlooking for countless years. Don't you want more people to experience your content? Isn't this expansion worth it? And also, there's some takeaways, the curb cut effect. If that comes up, that's always so much fun. That's kind of a tangent, but it literally comes down to saying, here's this opportunity that you get to do. You get to choose to expand something that hasn't been expanded in a way that is a win across the board. It's a win-win. I call it a win-win-win. I mean, it's so enjoyable to have that conversation. And I can imagine that you've been in that place where audio description awareness is normalized and it's becoming normalized across the industry.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's a great point. I mean, we used to talk a few years ago, we would say that audio description is where captioning was when we started. 10 years prior to that, there's no question that there was an educational process when we first got started, when we were talking to people about digital content. There were people who legitimately asked us, what are captions? Again, now this is over 15 years ago. But now captions literally are everywhere. And people who do not need the captions prefer to use the captions. So we've asked ourselves constantly, how do we get audio description to that? That is a great place to be where it's always there. Look at Netflix. Netflix describes almost every piece of content, and Apple does too, and they deserve credit too, in multiple languages. That's an amazing thing. Now, you talk about the get to and the ROI. Netflix is leading the pack. It's not by accident, right? So there's something there that people should be looking at and unpacking a bit more of how they've created an amazing user experience. And yes, content is king. You can say whatever you want. If you have bad content, it doesn't matter, and you have to have good content, but the user experience matters too.
When you think about that growing awareness, the education of your clients, and obviously we're still talking about audio description, where do you think there's still the most ground to cover?
In terms of audio description, I would say there's just so much content that's not described. There's still a lot of content that's not captioned. And I do think that's where you get into this whole, not all content is equal, and trying to understand what truly deserves it and what maybe doesn't. I mean, the skateboarding cat video probably doesn't need captions and or audio description all the time. Maybe it does. I mean, who am I to say? But I think there's a reality of where do you draw the line and what the expectations should be. And then there's obviously a big difference between an individual uploading a video to YouTube or TikTok and what a larger organization is putting out there. I think there's still a long way to go in terms of what could be made accessible. We as a company are spending an enormous amount of time on languages and multilingual audio description. That, no question now, like content is going everywhere around the world, and it is often made accessible in the source language and localized in a whole bunch of languages, but not made accessible in all those languages. So that now I'd say is a multiplier effect, if anything. So there's a lot of work to do there, and I do think it starts with awareness. I really do. The good news is with some of these multilingual accessibility conversations is that it's the localization teams that are driving them, which is great because they are viewed as a revenue generating organization. So that's a good thing as opposed to a cost center.
If we were to step back from the distribution to the filmmaker that creates the content, if that filmmaker asked you what they owe a blind audience, not legally, but in the sense of the storytelling, what would you say?
It's a great question. Let me share actually a good parallel in the education space. So one thing that's happened as we think about Title II with the ADA that's coming out right now, that's interesting is that schools, especially large schools, are basically being told they need to make everything accessible. Everything that's digital must be accessible. That's the classroom experience, it's videos. And when we say accessible, we mean WCAG 2.1 AA, which means captions and audio description on everything. And we talk about budget constraints. I mean, there's a concern there for sure. So, what some schools are trying to do is weave this into the educational process with the faculty and to say, you can keep budgets down you can help us keep budgets down by being really descriptive in your lecture. And if you are going to put slides up or if you're going to put visuals up, make sure you cover everything that's happening visually. And it's not a crazy request when you think about it on the surface. Now, at the same time, you're talking about asking professors who've done a thing a certain way for 30, 40 years. That might be hard to change. But the idea, the concept of creating a lecture environment where you actually say everything that's on a
Yeah.
slide, that doesn't sound
Yeah.
crazy. And I think that's a really nice way to start. And it will cover a lot. That's a really nice approach. I don't think it's possible to expect every single class though to do that perfectly. It's just not possible. But it's the right idea. On the film side, I really do think it's hard to ask someone to do things a certain way, but I think asking them to be aware of the multiple audience realities, we'll say, and just understand the number of types of people who could be consuming the content, I think is a great start. So I think everything with this, with accessibility especially, starts with awareness.
We've covered a lot here. Anything else that we haven't talked about that you'd love to share with our audience?
The only other thing I'd say that we're really excited about is not to be repetitive, but this idea that not all content's equal, but there's a ton of content and a ton of different types of people who want to consume it. And so thinking through how to make it accessible is critical. And accessible means a lot of things. What we like to say is that accessibility is about enabling people to consume content however they want to or need to. That could be because of a disability. It also could be because of a language gap. What we're building right now is a lot of solutions around multilingual accessibility and localization. And, like I said, we use AI in certain cases. We have humans in pretty much every case. And we have almost human only type stuff, as well. The solution to the use case is so critical, and thinking about how to make it truly accessible and enjoyable for that person in that context is just something that people need to think through and make it part of the production and distribution process.
Consume however they want or need to. What a great back to the philosophy, right?
Yeah, I mean that's it right there. To me, language and disability go hand in hand in terms of accessibility. It's access to content.
How can we follow your company or you?
We are active on LinkedIn. We go to a number of events. I am trying to be more active on LinkedIn personally, which I can laugh about a little bit. but I'm trying. And, I think we do have a lot to share. So on our website, our team is really good about publishing best practices and just updates in the market of what's happening. We try really hard to be a sharer when it comes to this and share perspectives and bring in experts as well to talk about what they're doing in their side of the world. And accessibility spans a lot of different roles.
Thanks so much for joining us today.